All right. Well, I'm so excited to have you here with us, Jannah. I'm wondering if you could start us off by just sharing a little bit about yourself.
Peace. I'm Jannah Bierens. I am a Black biracial North Carolina native who uses feminine and gender non-conforming pronouns. That's how I identify. Currently, I am founder and principal of Freedom. This is my own consulting and facilitation group that I've just recently started after being in public health for 20 years, probably moving over 20 years now. One of the reasons I got into public health right when I went into undergrad was really, I was really touched by watching my grandfather deal with the complications of diabetes. I was also at the same time very agitated around how we talked about diabetes and hypertension, and how because if you're Black, you're going to get diabetes or high blood pressure. It just really bothered me a lot. And so when I went into school, I was trying to figure out why we talked about it in that way, and why was race a risk factor if race is not biologically real. And so that led me down this whole journey for the past 20 years working in communities. And what I realized when I got into the local public health scene in Durham, North Carolina is where I worked most of my career. I realized that my curriculum didn't really translate to community practice. A lot of the frameworks were really good, but sometimes I had to change them and make them more culturally relevant. And I just continued to be driven by this deep passion for reversing and eliminating historically rooted Black health disparities. I realized that conditions and environments and communities seemed very influential to people's health, but we weren't often taking that into account. And so as a health educator, a fitness instructor, a nutrition educator, I was teaching people to live better. But I realized a few years in that if I teach someone how to eat healthy or how to exercise, and they don't have full service grocery stores or safe places to exercise or affordable places to exercise, that education is not helpful, that they can't use that. And so then I started thinking about those social determinants of health. And from there, I just continued to ask why. So I've spent a lot of time with residents who have been marginalized just by design, by how our communities have been created. And I hold a strong belief that our collective justice and healing are critical to centering our shared humanity, our bound liberation, and improved health outcomes for all.
Great. Thanks for that background on you. I'm wondering if you can, given that work that you've done over many years, why for you is it so important that we understand history for that work?
One of my favorite quotes that I hold with me in the work that I do is by Marcus Garvey. And he says that a people without the knowledge of their history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. And I remember first reading that, and it was so powerful to me at this time when I was starting to get agitated. I was reading books and I was learning something different than what I learned in school. And it was instilled in me as a child that knowledge is powerful, that we should always seek it, and that no one can take it away. I understand more deeply now why my Black mother, who was brought up during Jim Crow in South Carolina, was always very adamant about my learning, education, and reading. So I love to read, I love to learn. Knowledge is power, wisdom is wealth, and those things keep me rooted. So when I think about that quote, I think about being a tree that is rooted, that is connected. And because I'm rooted, I can resist. I can resist believing and adhering to false narratives and stereotypes about myself and about others that I love, but about other people that I've never even met yet. And I realized that exploring history allows us to explore ourselves socially and racially, and where we fall within these constructs of history and racial and social arrangement that everyone's not aware of because everyone's not impacted the same by it. And that history doesn't dissolve, it only evolves. It merely molds, morphs with the times. Our history tells us about our roots. And Angela Davis always says that being radical is about grabbing things by the root. And so me putting these things together with my experience have led me to believe that we just can't dismantle, ineffective systems without understanding how they were created in the first place, that we didn't build this, we inherited it, but we have a responsibility to make sure it works for all of us.
Wow, that's such a great perspective. And yeah, focusing on the roots is such a important way to think about our work. I'm wondering also how you see that historical events or historical policies are really shaping health today.
I think it's not something we often think about, like the average person doesn't think about. Another quote, James Baldwin is one of my favorite authors. I love this quote, and I do have quotes that I carry with me literally every day to keep me rooted and reminded that history is not the past, it is the present, that we are carrying our history with us. Each person has history, tradition, culture that comes with them, and we are our history. And if we pretend otherwise, we are literally criminals. And so when I think about culture and how it's shaped, it requires social and political and economic power. Like, who has the power to shape our society, decide what is valued, what is right, what is beautiful, what is normal? And outside of our actual construction of race and the pseudoscience that perpetuated dehumanization and diminishing based on skin color, our country was founded on a myriad of exclusionary enactments signed into law that stayed on the books for years and even decades and never found unconstitutional, well, and even if they were, right, they weren't reversed. And so I think about things like the 3-5 Compromise, the literal institution of chattel slavery, Indian Removal Act, the word Indian removal, Chinese exclusion, Japanese internment, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. I mean, this is mass land theft. This is exploitation of labor, of groups of people. This is encaging people because they don't fit into who's determined to be a man, if all men are created equal, right? Like our Declaration of Independence. That was our Declaration of Independence, right? And then excluded folks. So that's literally our foundation. And so when I'm hearing politically people talking about race neutral solutions, but even just in different fields, like we need race neutral solutions. Let's take race off everything. But the problem with that is that our country was founded on these enactments I just listed, and those were race specific. And so if we're going to approach this with race neutral solutions, we have to understand that may not be productive because of what's already been done. Those seeds have been planted and they have grown. And now we have to address them at their roots.
Absolutely. And you've started to give some examples, but I'm wondering if there's other ways you think about how ignoring our history can cause problems when we're trying to solve inequities or trying to improve our society. How can ignoring history really cause problems or be an impediment?
A huge one for me in public health, because of my work in chronic disease, obesity, health behavior change, was really, I remember specifically, because I have moments on my journey. In 2010, we got really excited about Healthy People 2020, and we brought in the social determinants of health. So no longer were we putting that individual burden and responsibility on people and their choices and their behaviors. We were including now that people's lives are impacted or influenced by things around them. What I found very problematic is because I was out there as a health educator carrying my little cart around with my food models, my cholesterol arteries and all my little toys and teaching, right? Educating folks on living healthier. And what I realized is when, I looked around, I remember a woman telling me, go outside and look at the grocery store. Literally, she told me this. And I started looking at grocery stores in different zip codes. And it was in 2010 where I started thinking, there's something here. Why do some communities look different? And why is it when I start asking people, when I name these certain things in communities, they know exactly what I'm talking about? I started bringing a collage of things that were in different communities, and people would sit there quietly, but I could tell people knew where we were, right? And so when I think about our determinants of health, I think about, well, how did they come to be that way? How is it that these things are impacting people, and why do they look different? And so the Homeowners Loan Act, National Housing Act, the 1940s GI Bill, I think about that New Deal, and I've often even heard like how that was a great thing for this country. But in the back of my mind, I know who was locked out of that. And African-American and Black folks were locked out a lot of those, those advantages to take that money, those mortgage, those loans, and move out to the suburbs. They were locked out of that. So that legacy of lockout that started on the foundation of these exclusionary enactments then shows up in these policies that work well for some, but not for others. And so we saw how like that came about with discrimination under the Housing Act of 1949. We saw land use regulations that allowed residents from wealthier neighborhoods to restrict what comes into their communities. Combined, a lot of these policies really created this enforcement and perpetuating of racial and socioeconomic segregation since the 1930s. It was not reversed. And now what we see is this like almost reverse, where people are moving now into the inner cities And who gets to decide where quality places to live are, and so I've been watching that, and it's very interesting. We think about redlining, and we think about the Federal Highway Act. A lot of people don't even know what the Federal Highway Act was, but it demolished Black and brown communities across this country to connect the white folks that moved out to the suburbs back to the inner city. And now what we're seeing is this idea around, revitalization or gentrification. So who gets to decide what is good, quality, valued? Again, we see this happening, and who's getting pushed out to the sides, who's being left out. Again, that legacy that has started at the foundation, continuing to weave this thread that we still have attached to us and we're still carrying forward.
Yeah, wow, that idea of the legacy of lockout and just how much that shapes our present day, right? And when we willfully ignore that, just how we come to different answers and different solutions. I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit about when you do work in communities, or we're thinking about any work in a community, making policies, making programs, trying to improve people's lives. How can a historical perspective actually change the type of work and the type of solutions we come to?
Yeah. One thing that has become very fascinating to me probably in the last 8 years was data. And really, when I think about data, what I found, what came up for me just as emergence was looking at data. You see this arrangement, you see a hierarchy. I say human hierarchy, and some people, they don't understand that, but there's this invisible hierarchy that exists in our data, right? And there's bookends. And I won't get into that, but if you follow that data all the way back to the founding of this country, and then look at how those enactments and laws have contributed to our racial hierarchy, it's fascinating to me that the hierarchy that was created, that emerged during, the early parts of this country's, founding on top of, let's think about stolen land and exploited labor, and how that shows up in our data. And I won't get into specifics, but there's a history there. And it really explains the why and the how. I think often we put out that there's gaps, disparities. For a long time, I was trained to say being Black is a risk factor for diabetes. I remember that. And I remember feeling my body reacting to that. I did not like it. I did not understand it, but I didn't know how to articulate it any other way. This is the way I was trained. And so what I learned is that I actually came to the data with my own stories. So my stories caused me to be agitated by the data because it wasn't being put out right. There's more to this. We're missing a whole narrative to the numbers. We're missing the stories to the statistics. And some of us come with our stories, and we get acclimated to the data, right? And some people come in with the data, and that depends on your experience, your lived experience, how proximate you are to racism and other oppressions that uphold structural racism. And so if our inequities are rooted in injustice, right, our conditions were created at the root, then it only makes sense that equity requires justice. So equity without a justice lens is counterproductive. And I think it's important that when we add that historical perspective, what's really important to me is that we take that personal responsibility and that burden off of whole groups of people, and blaming and shaming folks, and start naming what the isms are, naming what the inequities are, naming the roots, normalizing conversations around things that cause discomfort, because discomfort leads to discovery, right? And with no negotiation needed at this point. We no longer need negotiation around why we should be talking about these things. They're well documented. And so when I was reading something by W.E.B. Du Bois in the 1800s, I was struck. This was about 5 years ago. I was struck by how similar some of those same conditions he was talking about still exist today. When I studied the Black Panther and Black Power movement, I was struck by how similar it is to the Black Lives Matter movement, and how we are still fighting for the same things. And people say, oh, we're post-racial. We had a Black president. But that Black president came after a legacy of others, right? And so culture eats policy for lunch. Systems are intelligently designed and working invisibly in the background. So many of us may not even question anything. But for those of us who do, when you ask why, you reveal the lie. And I think that we continue learning every day, and you never stop learning. And so it is a continuing learning, agitation, uncomfortable feelings, and really reflecting on why we feel these ways. Where do we sit in this arrangement? How do we fit into history? How does our family come into history, right? So all of those things, and it's multi-layered. But that's a start. I think that we get the why and the how when we start sharing more about the data, not just that inequities exist, but why and how they came to be.
Definitely. Yeah. This conversation is bringing to light so many great perspectives and really gems of kind of how you think about things and how we all can shift our thinking. I'd love to close by just asking if you have any recommendations for folks who are watching this interview and thinking about what can they do to better learn history and apply that knowledge to work in the world that actually improves conditions for people, reduces inequities, and works towards justice. What are some recommendations you have for folks?
I truly believe that foundational training is important. I feel like lately, I know there's a lot of performance going on. There's a lot of people saying, hey, we need training. And then there's nothing else. I know that that is happening. That has been an experience that I've, in the past 10 years, that I have seen and been a part of, to be honest. And I think it's important that beyond training that we build trust, right? I believe that transformation requires us moving from transactional, which requires trust and transparency, and truth, transparency. You can't have trust without that. I often think of, I have a visual where like trust is a car and truth are the wheels, transparency is the gas. You can't go anywhere. You can't get to transformation from transactional, right? Which to me is sitting in that performance place where transformation is sitting in the practice place, because practice means progress, not perfection. We're not trying to be perfect. Perfect is inequitable. So taking that training and building beyond anything that sits out to you or that you're curious about, continue learning. Building relationships to me is like building bridges. Bridges take us to the unknown. And so as you're going into these trainings, you can't just stop there. You have to continue to explore yourself. Where do you fit into this information and education that you receive? How do you continue learning? How do you continue to build relationships with people and do your own internal work as we more deeply understand ourselves? And that may sound interesting to some, is that deepening relationship with yourself, but we're sitting in our bodies and we don't know ourselves. We don't have tools to explore ourselves racially and socially. And I think that's something that those foundational trainings can help bring up, but that there has to be room to process. And that's one of the things that I help, organizations do, is to think about, how do you have time for humanity and processing these feelings that come up? What do these feelings mean? Because our body informs us. When you have tension or discomfort, it's informing you of something. So how do we turn that into information and education, because exploration is education, into a way that how we interact with each other? So the more that I know, love, and accept myself, I learned that, and I started to love and accept myself after learning true knowledge and history that helped me to see that I can be who I am and it's okay. I think everyone should have that, right? But then that in turn impacted how my relationships with people. And when you collect and connect and collaborate forward, you have all these ideas moving towards the same place, because there's no one way to do a thing. Not like we think there is, like there's no either or, there's both and. That is powerful. That when we think about coming together and our similarities being special, but our differences not dividing us, but providing us their gifts, their superpowers. And that's kind of how I look at people. Every single person has a unique gift and contribution to the world. Every single person. That gives me hope. And that's part of the work. And I know that is uncomfortable for some people, because we're told to leave those emotions at the door, leave your humanity at the door, but let's bring humanity back to health, because that's how all of us move into a place where we can thrive. And how we thrive looks different. We can't decide that for people, right? And so centering humanity, moving a little bit away from capitalistic practices where time is money, and really allowing people to be human. I think the pandemic has shown us a lot about our organizations and what happens to humanity when we're not centering it and being intentional, right? So beyond the training, deepening relationship with yourself, with others, being intentional, continuously learning. You can learn from everything and everyone around you if you're open to it. Being open to that too. I mean, you have to be open to these things as well. And it takes time. Just knowing that you're not going to learn it overnight, and that it's a lifetime of learning, because it's been a lifetime of socialization. And so even unlearning, I would say, Paul. Yeah.
Yeah, those are so important. And I think, yeah, that lifetime of learning. So, whether folks are, starting that journey with history and learning history, or already on that journey, I think the points you're making about kind of both self-reflection but then also collective reflection and building relationships is really crucial for how we move forward. I just want to say thank you so much for sharing these perspectives and having this conversation with me. I'm so appreciative.
Thank you for having me.